Hey everyone, welcome to the SOLA Network podcast. My name is Kevin Yee, youth, college, and young adults pastor at Church Every Day in Los Angeles, California. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing Pastor Scott Sauls. He's the senior pastor at Christ Presbyterian Church in Nashville, Tennessee. Is married to Patty, has two daughters, Abby and Ellie. And previously, Pastor Scott was the lead and preaching pastor for Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City. He's written a number of books, and today we're here to talk about, I have the Kindle copy here of A Gentle Answer. Pastor Scott, welcome. So glad.
Thanks for having me, Kevin. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, so I thought we could just get right into it. Again, people want to hear you more than they want to hear from me. And I thought we should talk about sort of the genesis of the book. I know that this is the topic of the book is something that you're deeply, deeply passionate about in terms of how we respond, how we communicate in a gospel-centered way about things that have deeply fractured our culture. So this book is very, very timely. I don't think it could have come at a better time with regards to how much we need to learn from you in with regards to how we have difficult conversations about things. So I'd love to kind of hear, the origin story of your book.
So I wrote the book, Kevin, I started writing it about 18 months ago. And originally the idea was to put something out there a few months before the American presidential election. It hasn't gone well, those seasons in the past. Every 4 years, there is polarization and a lot of bickering, and cable news ratings go way up, and people get upset and snippy. And I thought, what would it be like to release something maybe the summer before all of that frenzy happens? And so that was the idea, was to boot off of Proverbs 15:1, a gentle answer turns away wrath. Maybe this will be a good opportunity for the Christian witness to shine as a countercultural sort of kindness movement when everybody else is turning in on each other. The irony is that we haven't hardly even talked about the election yet, and we are almost at July as we're talking. We're mid-June right now, and so many other things have kind of been thrust into front center of the conversation, and they're very important, meaningful things. But this book has turned out to be very, very timely. I'm very, actually quite sad for all the reasons why it's timely, and yet thankful to be able to be part of the conversation as well.
Yeah. Very recently, it's come to my attention that in 2 Timothy 3:3, the Apostle Paul lists what will happen to people. There would be godlessness in the last days. And as part of that list of things that he mentions, he uses the word unappeasable or irreconcilable or unbending is one translation as well. And totally, I think, again, with regards to the timeliness of this book, we live in an age where people don't seem to listen to one another well. And so I wanted to ask, because so much of this book is about this, how does Christ's pattern of gentleness help us to kind of cut through the challenges of such a polarized time?
Well, to your point, Kevin, Paul also wrote to Timothy about how there will be people in the churches who have a craving for controversy and quarrels, who are actually looking for a fight. And of course, he was confronting that as being counter to the gospel. But to your question, the gentleness of Christ, I think it's really important to realize that Christ had an 8th I am statement. We talk about the 7 I am statements of Christ in the Gospel of John. There's an 8th I am statement that he makes in Matthew chapter 11, where he says, I am gentle and humble in heart. At the very center of his identity is gentleness and humility. He's the one who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking on the nature of a servant. He washed his disciples' feet to demonstrate to them and to us what true greatness really is, what true power really is. Think about even his behavior on the cross toward those who were opposing him. On his way to the cross, he refers to Judas as friend, even as Judas is in the act of betraying him. There's a picture of his gentleness. On the cross, he cries out, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do," to those who are torturing him. To the thief on the cross who'd been insulting him just a few moments earlier, he responds to the man's question, "Please remember me in your kingdom. Today you will be with me in paradise," sort of gently assuring him. And then he rises from the dead, and Peter is filled with shame and self-loathing for his 3 denials. And Jesus makes a point of restoring Peter. And in fact, when the women meet the angel of the Lord at the tomb, the angel of the Lord says, this is in Mark's gospel, specifically to the women, "I want you to go tell the others and Peter," as if to say, and especially Peter, that I'm coming to them. Yeah, and, wow. He's just always responding to our issues with even our hostility toward him with a gentle answer. God demonstrates his own love in that while we were still sinners, that's when Christ died for us. And so if that's the grace that we've received, if that's the gentleness that we've received, if we've already been given a gentle answer, then it seems likely that that's going to change the posture of our hearts and make us a lot more difficult to offend, and make us a lot more likely to go first in trying to defuse these, sort of polarized conversations and try to seek solutions together.
Yeah, that's really good. I loved how gospel-centered you were in your responses to a lot of the criticisms that you faced in your life. There's a really great reminder in there about how sometimes the way that we bristle at particular criticisms can be just one of the ways in which we don't believe in the gospel necessarily in those moments, because we aren't assured of Christ's love for us and our identity being secure in Christ. And so we can lose our patience, or we can lash back or something. And I just loved how vulnerable you were about that. And especially as a public figure, I'm sure you do receive criticisms. And I'm wondering, the gentleness of Christ is something that we as Christians should be striving for. And I'm wondering what kinds of practical practices that we can, kind of prepare ourselves with in terms of learning how to do that well. I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit with regards to how we respond.
Kevin, I think the answer resides in a couple of statements that Jesus made. The first was when he said, when we're in conflict, to make sure that before we presume to remove a speck from somebody else's eye, we remove the log in our own. And he's talking to all of his disciples, and he's saying, let's say there are 2 of you, 2 disciples of Jesus Christ who are in conflict with one another. If both of them go into the conversation under the assumption that I'm actually the biggest problem here, the thing that I need to address first and most is my own contribution to this conflict, and then I will be in a position to help my brother or my sister with the speck, because we do want to address the specks, because the speck can turn into an infection, and an infection can turn into blindness, right? But if 2 people come with that posture that hey, I don't presume to be holier than thou. In fact, I know that I'm part of the issue here. It's going to go a lot better than than if both parties go into the conversation, or even if just one party goes into the conversation thinking, well, the log's in your eye, and all I've got in mind is a speck, if even that. That's what you call self-righteousness. And I think just keeping in mind the call to deep humility that Christ has given us. So he's going to exalt those who are humble, and he's going to humble those who exalt themselves. The other is just this whole thing in the Bible about being quick to listen and slow to speak. Oftentimes we get that reverse too, where we're quick to speak and slow to listen. So these are some sort of heart postures and behaviors that Christ himself has given us to lean into and consider and meditate on when we engage in conversations that involve conflict. But I think the other one is empathy, to realize that everybody is hurting, everybody's carrying a battle that they're fighting, and that includes the person you're at odds with or the person that's at odds with you. And sometimes if we can just discipline ourselves to remember that this is not just a person that I've got issues with right now. This is a person that has some pain, and sometimes hurting people will hurt people, and so there, a lot of it really has, Kevin, to do more with the mindset than it does with anything else, of just going in humbly and empathetically to conversations where it's hard to be either, and yet the Lord's given us the resource in the Holy Spirit and in the gospel to be able to do that.
Yeah, I really love that. I've also heard it said another way, like all sinners are also sufferers. And it's that idea of like recognizing that when you're getting into some of these more contentious debates, if you know that people are also burdened by the things that they're working through, that it makes it a lot easier for us to have grace in the way that we speak. I will say that one of the things too that we're seeing, especially now, so here in 2020, we are now 3 months into most of the U.S.'s, shutdowns and quarantines, lockdowns, and so there's also, on top of the racial justice and racial reconciliation issues, you also have just loneliness and isolation during this time of pandemic. And I think that breeds a lot of cynicism too, especially with younger millennials and Gen Z in particular. I work a lot with that particular demographic, and I know a lot of the guys that are listening and reading to the SOLA network kind of fall into that category. And I'm wondering if you have any words of wisdom or advice for those of us working with that demographic also, with regards to how we can help walk them through this time and giving them sort of hope and resilience. Because I think this is a really tough time for a lot of them, especially when they think about their futures. And I think a lot of it kind of lends itself towards arguments on Facebook and arguments on Twitter, because that anger needs to go somewhere. You talk a lot about anger in your book as well, and just sort of healthy responses in terms of how we deal with that. So if you could speak to that, I think that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, it's a very hard time right now to be a young adult, a recent college graduate, or even a college student, as you look ahead and think about job opportunities, career opportunities. It's a very, very different climate than it was for my generation, Generation X. When I was getting out of college, there were plenty of opportunities out there, and not only opportunities, options. You could choose a career path, and I think there's a big challenge to that too, because I think that the millennial generation in general, this is a very generalized statement, but has a lot higher expectation than my generation did about starting out with a great job that's completely fulfilling, and that it's right in the pocket of who I am and what I think I'm called to be, and so I think there's something to take ownership of, as well as something to lament. The lamentable thing is it's such a hard climate right now. the thing to take ownership of is that the Lord may actually have a different path for us than the one that we dream of, straight out of college or in young adulthood. And we really have to be flexible and malleable and receptive to whatever opportunities the Lord might be putting in front of us, even if it's not our dream opportunity. And to realize that oftentimes those dream opportunities happen to us over time after we've grunted it out in maybe work that we don't find extremely satisfying, and yet it's valuable because it's work, and all work has dignity to it. Bear in mind too that over 85% of the world's working population does not experience great satisfaction with their job. It's actually a very significant minority, and I think the millennial generation in particular is very surprised at jobs that lack satisfaction. And there's something to be said for the building of character in work and activities that we really have to serve. We're called to serve. To serve is to lean against our own kind of impulses and natural kind of likings and so on. But along with that, it's a very lamentable thing to think about. Wow, it's so much harder for this generation than any other living generations before it. To find that lane of calling right now, at least not without a whole lot of obstacles to overcome. And so the good news is the Psalms are filled with prayers that affirm the lament and even the anger that's there about a world that just doesn't feel like it's working the way it's supposed to. So yeah, but get in community, stay in community, and working these things out together with other people who are going through similar things under the leadership of people like Kevin here is a really good and healthy idea as well.
Because you've written a number of books. I think your previous book, Jesus Outside the Lines, has spoken into a lot of this stuff. You've also written Befriend, talking about gospel sort of centered friendships. And I would love for you to speak just a little bit more into that with regards to, again, with regards to loneliness and isolation. You talked about getting into community. That, only because like I've seen this. So I've been a youth pastor for 15 plus years, and I've seen over time just how much harder it is for people to get into friendships. And part of that is, with the polarization, I think comes a lack of trust. It's just harder to trust people. You kind of have to vet people based off of the things that you've seen them post in order for you to know whether or not they're a safe person. Can I engage in a conversation with them? And I feel like that's a little bit antithetical to what our heart needs to be as Christians, because we want to enter into spaces and we want to love others regardless of their political dispositions. We want to be able to come in and serve others. And during this time of, again, just the isolation, what are some things that you would say to, again, that younger generation that maybe understands better their own issues, but is willing to kind of go in there and really help to foster and create community? What are some things that you would encourage them to do?
I'll make a statement that might offend some of your listeners. I'm okay with that, as long as it produces rich conversation for your community.
Yeah.
With each other. But there's a difference. Here's my offensive statement. There's a difference between saying that you value diversity and valuing diversity. There's a big difference between those two things. There's a difference between there's a difference between those two things. And the truth of the matter is, you don't really value diversity until you stop being offended by diversity. If that makes sense. You're more intrigued and curious by diversity than offended by it, when diversity comes to town, so to speak. There's all this talk on college campuses, for instance, about safe spaces. And in your question set up just a second ago, you use the word spaces for conversation, and you use the word safe. And there's all this talk about safe spaces, right? Um, where now, especially on college campuses, students can rise up against professors for teaching ideas that hurt their feelings. And to this is the offensive statement: grow up. Grow up. Because and Van Jones, you can Google this and maybe show it as a video to your students or to whoever is part of this conversation with you, Kevin. Van Jones, who's a political commentary, he's African American. He leans more to the left. I know he leans more to the left politically. He's a very well-known commentator. He's typically on the cable news channels and such, but he had this really interesting statement in an interview that he did with David Axelrod. And David Axelrod asked him what he thinks about safe spaces. And you would expect that a such a staunchly blue state guy would say, well, I'm all about the safe spaces. Students shouldn't be subjected to ideas that upset them. But he said the opposite. He actually said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said it's ridiculous to demand that you be safe from other people's ideas. I want you to be safe physically. I want you to be safe from assault. I want you to be safe from abuse, from physical abuse. But in terms of ideas and ideology, I don't want you to be safe at all. I want you to be strong. And I want you to be ideologically strong.
Yep.
And I want your convictions to be so well developed that they can withstand, any type of ideological pushback on your convictions. And I also want your humility to be so strong that you're open to be persuaded of other ideas that might actually be healthier and more life-giving than the ideas that you have now. And I thought that was remarkable for a very progressive leader to decipher the difference between and really push back on this idea of ideological safe spaces. Because eventually you're going to be out in the real world, and the whole safe space thing is not going to work for you in the workplace. It's not going to work for you in the courtroom. It's not going to work for you, as you're, doing whatever you're doing professionally. It's not going to work for you in your family when you get in an argument with your spouse or when your kids push back on. It's not going to work. And so the faster we can grow up, in terms of really embracing diversity, instead of just talking about how we embrace and love diversity, diversity is really the willingness to be curious about and humble in the presence of ideas and perspectives that challenge our own. And what better place than inside the body of Christ, where Christ affirms the value and dignity of everybody at the table, and puts us together like he did in the New Testament, putting Jew and Gentile together, so that we can work these things out and develop together a more refined understanding of who God is and what it means to be a flourishing human being who loves his or her neighbor well.
Yeah.
How's that? Is that too much?
No, I think
Okay.
that's exactly what I think helps our the younger church develop some of the resources that are also needed to be, I think, as you speak, as you say in your book, like a prophetic voice, right? Because there are things they believe in and there are things they want to stand up for. But I think with regards to a lot of the ideological sensitivity, it becomes hard for them to act upon those impulses and to kind of be that prophetic voice, which is something that you talk about in your book. One of my favorite quotes that you talk about is, so Christlike gentleness, this is what you say in your book. So Christlike gentleness and prophetic strength do not cancel each other out. Rather, they complete each other. It is Jesus's love, his gentleness and grace towards us that equips us and compels us to stand up and speak out against injustice and hurt in the world. And I just think that's such a powerful statement of how, even though the book is a gentle answer, there is a lot of parts of it that you are really compelling us and pushing us to be that prophetic voice into our culture. And I'm wondering if you can talk just a little bit more about that, especially, again, I know there's so much that's happened in 2020 that it seems like the political stuff is like, when is that going to hit us? But it will hit us very, very soon. And I think that there's definitely going to need to be Christians rising up as a prophetic voice to talk about this. And I'm wondering if you can expand on that just a little bit and encourage us to think about that well as we head into what is probably going to be one of the most contentious political cycles for sure.
Well, I'll try to keep this answer a lot shorter than the last one, Kevin. There is a book, or I'm sorry, there is a chapter in the book called "Doing Anger Well," or "We Learn to Do Anger Well." That's actually a byproduct of the Spirit's fruit of gentleness, is that we get angry in a really good way. C.S. Lewis wrote that Christianity is a fighting religion. We see what's wrong in the world and we fight, we attack the problem. And that's what righteous anger is. Righteous anger is the kind of anger that attacks problems, not people. Unrighteous anger attacks people and just adds to the problem. But righteous anger attacks the problem. And when you're attacking a problem instead of attacking a person, it actually opens the door of possibility of bringing the people that you're in disagreement with along to attack the problem together. Let's not shoot at each other, but let's put the problem in the center of the room and let's start shooting at that problem together to see if we can reach a greater degree of unity and peace through consensus building and mutual persuasion and active listening and apologizing and repenting and humbling ourselves as we also refine each other's perspective through the tension of diversity, like I was saying. And let's take shots at the problem, not at people. The Bible actually commands that we be angry in the Psalms as well as in Ephesians. Be angry and do not sin. That's what the literal Hebrew and Greek say. It's an imperative. It's not in your anger, don't sin. It's be angry, but sin not. So there are things to get angry about. Like Jesus got angry at the tomb of Lazarus. He got angry at death and he attacked death. He got angry at sin so that he wouldn't have to, and he attacked sin at the cross so he wouldn't have to attack people, but to rescue us from ourselves and our sin instead. And he got angry and turned the tables over in the temple because he was angry at the corruption of worship and the exploitation of the house of God for material gain. And so, but he's attacking problems. And sometimes he has a sharp word to say to people, but it's always with a goal to restore them and not to, bludgeon them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's really, really powerful, actually, because I think that sets free people to my emotions can be a part of the response, that God can use my emotions in a really positive way when it comes to how I deal with what's happening in the world that's around us. Because I do think there's also a sense of hopelessness with a lot of the crazy that's happening. That's really helpful. I do want to end with one last question. One of the reasons why I think I love your book so much and why I love your ministry so much is because what's happening in our culture right now is we're seeing sort of the Western American culture is kind of, there seems to be a seeping Eastern dynamic of honor shame influencing the way that we talk to each other, especially over social media. And I just find that the way in which you write, you're always bringing in sort of honor shame dynamics that I find to just be like, it's one of those things where it's like, oh, this is a pastor who gets the way in which I think about and kind of filter through the issues in my life. And you know, the way that I'm thinking about it is like, I like the way that I feel seen in the stories that you share, because you do fall back on that language. And I do think that's really helpful. Can you speak to that dynamic a little bit? And so like how that language has really kind of shaped your gospel center ministry at your church, and just even on a personal level, I feel like.
About honor, shame,
Yeah. So that dynamic, I feel
inclusion.
like, is
Yeah.
really has been at the forefront of the way that you've talked about the gospel, and I think that's one of the
Yeah.
the things that have first kind of turned me into your ministry, with regards to the way in which you speak about stuff, like your blog and those kinds of things. Like, I'm always like just sort of blown away at how insightful you are with regards to that. And I've always felt like, wow, this is somebody who's really speaking the gospel into a particular dynamic that exists in me culturally, you know?
Well, thank you, Kevin. And I will say that every culture has its um, shadow side, you might say,
Yeah.
and every culture has its virtues. And you put all the cultures together of the human community and get rid of the baggage and put all of the virtues, the unique virtues of every different culture, and you get something that looks more and more like the comprehensive image of God. One of the things that I learned, especially have learned and have been humbled by from Asian culture and Eastern culture in general, is the way that Eastern culture tends to put the tribe over the individual, or the community over the individual. And there's something quite beautiful about that. And there's something so right about that, even as we look at the New Testament. If and those who, have you been to seminary yet? I assume, have you been to seminary yet, Kevin? So you've studied Greek, and so you know that the second person references in the New Testament are almost all plural.
Yeah.
It's the New Testament is written to communities, not to individuals. And there's so much one anothering language. There's so much language about deferring to one another, and the first will be last, and the last will be first, and so on. And so that's the baby. When they talk about baby and bathwater, that's the baby of Eastern culture. Whereas Western culture, the bathwater is the way that we put me over everybody else. And we've got this just yucky thing called expressive individualism, where we have my truth and your truth, and my expectation as an expressive Western individualist is that the whole world will revolve around my truth. And if you will not get on board with my truth, whatever that is, then I will cancel you,
Yeah.
or I will box you out, or I will develop a mob or join a mob that's against people like you. And I think that's a big reason why platforms like Twitter have gotten in many ways so toxic, is because we're driven by expressive individualism, where it's my feelings and my own instincts and my own sort of narcissistic, self-centered way of thinking about the universe, that I'm the hero of the story and the center of the story, and everybody else's role is to be a supporting actor in my story. That's the shadow side that I think the virtue of Eastern, communal focus can provide a helpful corrective. Now, to shame and honor, I guess American culture is kind of shameless. We're very self-esteem oriented, and we have no shame. And I think it's important to recognize that there are healthy forms of shame.
Right.
Where it's shame actually is what opens us up to the gospel, and sets us on that trajectory of actually becoming beautiful people, beautiful human beings that reflect the Beatitudes and the fruit of the Spirit. It starts with the shame that we're born not quite right. We're all born with this thing called original sin, dead in transgression and sin, and God makes us alive and opens us up to the gospel and tells us, hey, I'm not holding your shame or your guilt against you. It's atoned, you're adopted, you're included, you're embraced, you're a friend of God, you're a child of God, you've got a glorious future, you're an heir of everything, heir of the kingdom. And so I think when those realities that the shame has been replaced with honor by our Father. He honors us. He delights in us. We're referred to as the apple of his eye in the scriptures. David prays in Psalm 8, what is man that you should desire him? That's kind of a statement of shame, right? And then he's reawakened to the fact that you've made him a little less than God. You've crowned him with glory and honor. There's that word, right?
Right.
It's the honor that God has crowned us with that addresses the shame that we experience and renders it null and void in terms of its ability to name us or to give us our identity.
Yeah.
And Brennan Manning, who's this Catholic writer who just understands so much about grace and Christian and gospel identity. One of his statements is beautiful. It's from his book called Abba's Child. He says, define yourself radically as the beloved of God, because every other identity is an illusion. And that's absolutely true when we're united with Christ. When we're united with Christ, then in the eyes of God, in the eyes of our Creator, in the eyes of our Father in heaven, everything that's true of Jesus is also true of us in the sight of God. We are blameless. We are faultless. We are beloved, and so on. And so if this is our identity and we're aware of it, it can't help but affect the way that we interact with each other and that we treat each other.
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis writes about this in The Weight of Glory, where he says, we don't realize this, but we've never met a mere mortal. And he says the very people that we interact with every day and that we snub and exploit, one day, could be such a glorious creature that if we saw them today in their future state, we would be severely tempted to bow down and worship. And, and he goes on to write just about the sacredness of our fellow human beings, which also, by the way, means that we're sacred too, created in the image of God. And so often, Kevin, I don't know about you, but I'm usually a lot more tired of myself than I am of other people. And I feel a lot more shame for me than I feel like dumping shame on other people. And sometimes when I dump shame on other people, it's because I feel so ashamed. I'm trying to deflect it, like Adam and Eve did in the garden. And so, man, but I don't know, Kevin, maybe you have ideas about this, that I haven't thought of, but I don't know if there's any other solution to either Western American shamelessness or Eastern culture, sort of driven by shame. I don't know if there's any answer to either one of those, except for what God has done for us in Christ. I haven't discovered another answer to that that's satisfying or adequate. Have you?
No, I think I think if I did, I'd be studying another book, but the Bible just keeps presenting that to me again and again and again. It's conviction and challenge, but it's also incredible amounts of hope and love that you receive, And so, but again, I think that's why I'm so taken by your ministry. Like this, like what you just said at the end is such an encouraging thing to hear. And again, as a minister of the gospel, this is what I need the most myself in order to do this ministry well. So, yeah, thank you for that. That was beautiful too. I love how poetic you are in the way that you explain those dynamics. And again, it's just super helpful in understanding how we are to view the other as we speak, as we share, as we discuss all of these things in the coming months to come. Especially, it's so good for us to be reminded of this. So yeah, thank you.
Thank
you,
Kevin.
Scott, so much for joining us on the SOLA Network podcast.